Hello, it's another Wednesday. Who would even think that we're already at Wednesday? I was spending some time this morning just reflecting and looking at this whole concept of going wider and the sermon this upcoming week and the transition from going deeper and higher, and what does it mean as a body to be casting a wider net, so to speak, as we are fishers of men and women. And I started to reflect and think about Jesus, and I found this image. I was looking for images of Jesus teaching and just some of the representation, and I found this image right here. And as you look at this image, I'm fascinated that crowds of people would gather because of who Jesus is. Mark chapter 6, it says, "And many people saw them leaving and recognized them and ran there together by land from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. And getting out of the boat, he saw the large crowd, had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And the hour that had already become late, when his disciples came up to him saying, 'The place is desolate and the hour is already late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding farms and villages and purchase something to eat for themselves.' But he answered and said to them, 'You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'Should we go and purchase bread for 200 denarii and give it to them to eat?' And he said to them, 'How many loaves do you have? Go look.' And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he ordered them all to recline in groups in the grass. And they reclined in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looking up to heaven, gave thanks and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples so they could set them before them. And he distributed the 2 fish to them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up the broken pieces, 12 baskets full of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. And I read this whole passage to you. I don't want to focus on the miracle today of Jesus. That's a whole other breakdown. What I really want to focus on is the crowd. And I say this because I think sometimes we get caught up in the crowd and we forget the stories that get to the crowd. Many times over, we as believers, we encounter stories. We have to be telling stories. We have to know our story. And I think about Jesus, and he had this art of storytelling to him that people would want to hear more. They wanted to be a part of the process. They wanted to engage him. I mean, time and time again through scripture, we see where he's in a home and the crowd gets too big and they have to leave. We see that sometimes he has to teach from a boat from the shore because the crowd got so large. Right here, you have this instance where they're walking along and the crowd gets to be 5,000 people because of his teachings and the miracles. And there's so much that goes into the crowd gathering. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of ingredients here, but it all gets back to the story. People told stories of Jesus that got people to be able to come to hear about the word. Remember, there wasn't this broadcasting that went on online. There wasn't this newsreel of what Jesus was doing. This was the verbal storytelling that went on, maybe in the inns and taverns and telling tales. And, I always go back to bards and their way of just being able to play some music and tell a story. But the tales of Jesus were growing. And I wonder, in your life, how often are you telling tales of Jesus? Is it something that's natural for you to talk about Jesus in your life? It's something that I've had to work on over the years, but I found that as I become more comfortable with my story, I become more comfortable telling my story. And I don't have to rely on tools of evangelism, so to speak, as much as it is relying on my personal experiences and personal experiences of friends and stories and tales of the Bible. And as they come together and flow, things happen. I was spending time talking with someone in the church this week just about knowing your story and being ready to tell it, being ready to engage with it, understanding it and knowing it, that if you've got 5-10 minutes with someone that's like, hey, what does Jesus mean to you? You can just tell them. And it's not this flowery speech or anything. It's just, it's on your heart. You know it. And I think sometimes we forget because we don't talk about it enough, but learning people's stories. So this week, as you think about it, go back to Mark chapter 6. Look in that chapter. Do some reflection on what Jesus is doing in chapter 6. I mean, because right after this is what he walks on water, right? That's a whole other conversation. But again, these are the stories of Jesus. These are the tales of Jesus that we grab a hold of and we hold into our hearts because we watch these tales happen in our own lives. And I leave you with this thought to just know your story this week. Ask the Lord to have a time that you can tell your story. Maybe it's to your own family. Maybe it's to your own child. Maybe it's to a coworker. Maybe it's to a volunteer that you're volunteering with somewhere. You know your world best, but ask the Lord to give you space to have your story told. I dare you to. Because once you get used to it, it becomes so much easier. And your life is important. And your life has meaning. And your experiences have meaning. And people do want to hear, especially when there's moments of despair or where they're hurting and they want to hear a good news. They want to hear your personal experience, not just a teaching from the Bible. And that's good. And sometimes we need to give scripture to people. But other times it needs to be our story about scripture.